was so different from what everybody else was doing. It took a lot of guts just to take off in a direction like that where nobody else was going at the time.
I mean, they were a powerful musical ensemble with something to say, and they were getting it across.
Here was a band that stepped up with multiple horns, multiple percussion, you know, someone playing excellent flute. You had, and just these big groups on stage, more people than you've seen on stage up to that point in Pittsburgh, creating what was always kind of a gamble.
Here on this field in 1983 is where I first met Stick Against Stone. It's Skinner's View Park, Eugene, Oregon. They were on the Rock Against Reagan tour. They had just come down from Olympia, Washington to play a show here. It was a wet, rainy, muddy field. My buddies from the punk band E13 had just finished up their set. After Mark finished his set, stage diving into the crowd, he grabbed the microphone and said, "Stick around for Stick Against Stone." They had mojo. They had, in my estimation at the time, they had it. They were young, hungry, aggressive, political. They had a vibe and a message, and they were totally owning it. And they were on this tour, which must have been like an odyssey, across the country in a yellow school bus, which was probably parked in the parking lot over here. I didn't know where they came from or exactly where they were going, but I knew what they were about was something I was interested in. The band came back to Eugene after their tour, and I became their manager slash sound guy. We all moved to San Francisco in '85, but they folded after a few years. They never released a proper album. But their music stayed with me, and I still had this vague hope of helping them release it. Brooke Dewar, the bassist from their Pittsburgh days, gave me some of their early recordings. And these songs were a whole different level of music, mainly because of their singer, John Creighton. His voice was passionate, hypnotic, and wild. His lyrics were focused, political, and the rhythms were powerful and driving. And they had a really tight horn section. I couldn't believe this kind of music came out of Pittsburgh in '81, and I wanted to know more about how it was created. Mainly, I wanted to know more about John.
Pittsburgh was very conservative musically. It was a working class town, shot and beer, boogie blues type of place for the most part. But the punks couldn't get arrested. There was really no room for that kind of irony in Pittsburgh.
Pretend your mind is a dress. Pretend your mind is a dress. Pretend your mind is a dress. Change it.
Pittsburgh was kind of a city of molasses. It was hard to get things done on a professional, artistic level. And there were a handful of people that were up to the challenge.
Like a lot of people have a tune that's stuck in their head. Creighton seemed to have a gamelan stuck in his. He was always thinking about different types of music. He was always carrying something different with him. Always had a book, always had a few records.
When you play a horn, it's like you sing it. You know, so, you know, when he did his lyrics and sang, and he picked up the horn, that was an extension of him.
John and I think it was Brooke Dewar that had suggested that we come over and jam with Dick Vitale and Chuck Sullivan. And I remember going over to, I think it was Myron Avenue is where they lived, and going and jamming with them, and it worked out really great because we had no guitar. It was great. He played, Brooke Dewar played bass, and John and I were doing horns. John had a saxophone and flute, and I did the whistle and the clarinet. Here we were with two percussionists and a bass player, and we thought this was great. You know, it was something different.
So Richard was able to kind of draw some people in. Richard had an idea about the sound he wanted. And you couldn't be, he's only got two hands. Even though you might not know that by watching him play, he was a little like watching Shiva sitting at the trap set.
Ann and I and Chuck and Dave Depew all went to a alternative curriculum high school called IMPLIED. Living right next door was Dick Vitale. I remember the first time I walked into Dick's apartment. He liked to play the drums naked, quite a bit. And there were all these high school students living right next door that would all just periodically parade up the back stairs into his place, and here's this wild man, just because he was just by far the most energetic drummer I had ever seen. It was eye-opening. It really did change my idea of music as a participatory thing, which a lot of what Stick Against Stone was audience participation.
And as soon as it started playing, you got the sense, I got the sense, it's in my ear yet, that the stuff was being invented right on the spot.
The night that we did the recording here at Danny's, John was rested, which is to say he hadn't been up for a series of days on end. That night he was on top of his game, on top of his playing.
In my career, I've worked with all sorts of music, from classical to jazz to whatever. I gauge my enjoyment of a performance on the intensity of the performer, and John was always way up there.
The tapes disappeared into in the trunks and in the storage and whatnot, and it wasn't until the last few years that people who were in the band at the time started asking about, geez, whatever happened to them. And when they surfaced and everybody started listening to them again, we were amazed that the things that we were doing good were really, really good. Of course, the thing that made it all the more poignant was the fact that John had passed, and here he was at the height of his wild power.
I decided to remaster these early recordings and release them on iTunes. In the summer of 2010, the band finally released their first album.
No, it's analog 1 and 2, that's your outputs.
At the same time, I began re-recording their songbook, using both original members and studio musicians. I knew that Richard, having been the driving force of the band, would have to be involved. I hadn't seen him in 20 years, but I went to California to see if he was interested. On the morning of Sunday, July 11th, 2010, we were waiting for Richard to arrive at a recording studio in Manhattan. He never showed up. Due to a traumatic brain injury he'd suffered years earlier, Richard had a seizure that day and passed away.
He's a true believer. That's one thing I said about Richard. I said, Richard, one thing about you, you drive people crazy, but you're a true believer. He hasn't given up on the dream,
For months I wondered what to do, and if the music would ever be performed again. But by October I knew I had to try.
It's one thing to have the recordings, but this music needs to be played.
Some Gonna rap, gonna sing, hit the drums and things. We're gonna slap the bass, you get the funk in your face. We're gonna jam a lot on the saxophone. We put it all down, call it stick against stone.